She just made history at Wimbledon, and she's telling everyone it's not enough. A teenager from a country with barely any grass courts just beat a defending champion on the most famous court in tennis. Then she lost the very next match, and somehow that loss is the part making her rivals nervous. Because when Eala walked off center court, she wasn't talking about pride or satisfaction or a job well done. She was talking about what comes next. She was talking about hunger. This is the story of a breakthrough that wasn't a peak. It was a warning shot. And by the time you finish this video, you'll understand exactly why the entire WTA Tour should be paying very, very close attention to a 21-year-old from Quezon City. To understand why Eala's Wimbledon run terrified so many people, you have to understand where she came from, because it is, quite simply, not a place that produces Wimbledon contenders. The Philippines is a nation of basketball courts, boxing gyms, and volleyball nets. It is not a nation of grass courts. It is not a nation with a tennis infrastructure that funnels children into academies at age 6, the way France or Spain or the United States can. And yet, somehow, out of Quezon City came a left-handed girl with a forehand that would eventually trouble some of the best players on the planet. Eala herself has never hidden this origin story. In fact, she leans into it. She grew up playing on a court that had simply been painted over a basketball court, far from any real grass surface. Think about that for a moment. While her future opponents were perfecting their slide on Wimbledon's lawns from childhood, Eala was learning the sport on concrete, thousands of miles from anything resembling the surface that would eventually make her famous. By the time she turned professional, she carried something with her that money and infrastructure can't buy, an almost desperate hunger to prove that where you're from doesn't determine how far you can go. She trained at the Rafa Nadal Academy, she climbed steadily through the rankings, and by 2026, she had already become something rare, a Filipino athlete whose fan base stretched far beyond her home country, into the enormous Filipino diaspora scattered across the United States, the Middle East, and Europe. But here's the thing about hype. It can also become a trap, because for years Eala was known as the exciting prospect, the future star, the watch this space player. She had talent, she had charisma, and she had a growing highlight reel. What she didn't have yet was a signature moment on the sport's biggest stage, a result so undeniable that nobody could call her promising anymore. They'd have to call her dangerous. Heading into the 2026 grass season, something had shifted. She won her second WTA 125 title in Birmingham, then reached the semifinals in Berlin, compiling a striking 12-4 record on grass heading into the season's biggest tournament. Along the way, she picked up wins that mattered, over a former Wimbledon champion, over a top 10 player. The results were quietly stacking up. The only question was whether she could do it when the whole world was watching, on the lawns that made this sport legendary. Nobody, not the pundits, not the bookmakers, not even some of her own fans, expected what was coming, because what Eala was about to do at Wimbledon wasn't just going to be a good tournament, it was going to rewrite 70 years of history for an entire country, and it was going to happen against opponents nobody gives away wins to. The stage was set. The girl from the painted-over basketball court was about to walk onto center court, and she was about to make sure nobody underestimated her again. But nobody, and we mean nobody, saw what was coming next, because the player Eala was about to face wasn't some easy first-round opponent, it was a defending Grand Slam champion, and what happened between them would change everything. Every underdog story needs one moment where disbelief turns into reality. For Eala, that moment came on a Saturday afternoon in early July, on the most intimidating court in the sport. Her opponent? Iga Świątek. Not just any player, the reigning Wimbledon champion, a 6-time Grand Slam winner, one of the most dominant forces women's tennis has seen in the last decade. On paper, this was supposed to be a formality, a respectable effort from the plucky Filipina before the tournament moved on to its real business. Nobody told Eala that. In a stunning third-round battle, Eala defeated the defending champion 7-6, 9, 6-2, a scoreline that doesn't even begin to capture the tension of that first set, a tiebreak so tight it required extra points just to settle. This was Eala's second career win over a six-time Grand Slam champion, but this one carried a weight the others didn't. This one happened on center court in the second week of Wimbledon, with an entire tournament and an entire country back home watching. The win extended her career-best run into the fourth round, marking new ground for the Philippines as a tennis nation. No player from that country, male or female, had ever advanced this far at a major tournament. Not in the amateur era, not in the professional era. This was uncharted territory made possible by a 21-year-old who grew up on a converted basketball court. And here's where the story stops being just about tennis and starts being something deeper, because in the immediate aftermath, Eala didn't celebrate like someone who'd simply won a match. She broke down. She could barely finish her sentence before the tears came, completely overwhelmed by the moment. This wasn't manufactured emotion for the cameras. This was a young woman confronting, in real time, the reality that she now belonged in a conversation she'd only ever watched from the outside. It's worth pausing here to ask yourself, how do you process a moment like that? You've just beaten someone who has spent years being told she's one of the greatest to ever play the sport. You've done it on the lawn everyone dreams about as a kid, and you've done it representing a country that has almost no history in this sport at all. That's not just pressure, that's the entire weight of a nation's tennis hopes landing on one match point. In her post-match reaction, Eala admitted she was overwhelmed, saying the achievement might look small to legends like Swiatek or Serena Williams, but for someone who grew up in the Philippines, it meant everything. And then, almost as an afterthought, almost like a warning nobody was quite ready to hear yet, she added something that revealed exactly where her head was already going. Being emotional, she said, didn't mean she was satisfied, so the next round, let's go. Read that again. In the very moment she should have been allowed to simply enjoy the biggest win of her career, Eala was already looking past it. That's not the mindset of someone content to be a feel-good story. That's the mindset of someone building towards something much bigger. And the tennis world was about to find out just how serious she was. The win over Swiatek should have been the story of the tournament. Instead, it became something else entirely. The moment that made an entire nation believe and made her next opponent's job significantly harder than anyone anticipated. If the win over Swiatek was the spark, what happened in the days after was the wildfire. Within hours, Eala's name was trending not just in tennis circles but across the Philippines as a whole, a country where basketball and boxing have always dominated the sporting conversation. Suddenly, a tennis player was leading the news. She dedicated the victory to her countrymen watching from center court and to her supporters back home, and in doing so, she turned a personal achievement into a national one. This is where you start to see the difference between a good result and a genuine cultural moment. Eala wasn't just winning matches, she was becoming a symbol. For young girls in a country where female athletes rarely get this kind of spotlight, watching someone who looks like them, who grew up like them, competing toe-to-toe with the best players alive, is the kind of moment that reshapes what an entire generation believes is possible. And Eala seemed acutely aware of the responsibility that came with that. In her press conference, she spoke about what it meant to be a role model, saying she wanted young fans to look at her journey not as a blueprint to copy, but as proof that they could carve out their own path entirely. She wants them to look at her and decide they want to become the first version of themselves, not the next Alex Eala. That's a remarkably mature thing to say for a 21-year-old in the middle of the biggest week of her career. But it also tells you something important about who she is, someone who understands that her platform extends far beyond her own results. Meanwhile, her fan base was expanding in ways that surprised even seasoned tennis observers. Long before Wimbledon, Eala had already built a passionate following among the Filipino diaspora, communities in Los Angeles, in the Middle East, across Europe who tuned in specifically because she was competing. But now, after beating a defending Wimbledon champion, that fan base exploded into something genuinely global. Casual sports fans who had never watched a tennis match in their lives were suddenly Googling her name, watching her matches, learning how to pronounce Świątek just so they could understand what had happened. She would go on to reach a new career high ranking of world number 28 as a direct result of this run, a number that weeks earlier would have felt like a distant ambition. Suddenly, it was reality, achieved not through incremental grinding on the lower tours, but through a statement run at the sport's most historic tournament. And this is exactly the moment where the narrative could have gone one of two ways. Some players, having achieved a career-defining result, coast on the emotional high. They relax. They let the achievement be the achievement. Eala's own words suggested she was building towards something else entirely, a fourth-round match against a dangerous, in-form opponent who had her own reasons to make a statement. The stage was set for a collision that would either cement Eala as a legitimate top-tier threat or send her back down to earth. Either way, the entire tennis world was now watching, and what happened next would reveal more about her character than the win over Świątek ever could. Winning is easy to talk about. It's how you respond to losing that actually reveals who you are, and what came next for Alex Eala would test exactly that. Every great sports story needs its gut punch moment, the point where the dream run collides with reality. For Alex Eala, that moment arrived on a Monday evening against Jasmine Paolini, the 2024 Wimbledon finalist, in a fourth-round battle that had absolutely everything. The match swung back and forth across 3 brutal sets, with Paolini eventually winning 4-6, 6-4, 3-6 to end Eala's historic run. But the scoreline barely tells the story. Paolini raced out to an early 4-1 lead in the first set, exploiting Eala's vulnerable second serve, and it briefly looked like the fairy tale might end quickly and quietly. It didn't. Eala fought back from facing 3 break points at 0-4-0, reeling off 5 consecutive points to hold serve and seize a 5-3 advantage, the kind of resilience that doesn't show up in a highlight reel but tells you everything about a competitor's nerve. She forced a decisive third set. She made Paolini earn every single point of that victory. In the end, though, experience and composure from a former Grand Slam finalist proved just enough. Paolini's own words afterward described her season as a roller coaster, admitting how tough things had been before finding her rhythm again, a reminder that even the players who beat Eala were fighting their own battles that week. For Eala, the immediate aftermath could have gone toward disappointment, toward excuses, toward the safe, diplomatic non-answers athletes often give after a heartbreaking loss. Instead, her press conference revealed something far more interesting. She admitted it was a challenging match and that Jasmine simply played great, refusing to diminish her opponent's performance. But she also refused to let the loss define the bigger picture. Asked directly what positives she could take from her deepest Grand Slam run yet, her answer wasn't polite deflection, it was pointed. She talked about how she'd handled pressure throughout the tournament, saying she was happy with how she faced it head-on and stayed composed when it mattered most. And then came the line that should genuinely worry every player ranked above her. Asked whether there were things she'd have done differently, she didn't hide from the honest answer. Of course there were. But rather than dwelling on it, she said she was really proud of how she'd handled things and simply needed to move forward and keep progressing. Read between the lines there for a second. This isn't the language of someone satisfied with a career-best result. This is the language of someone already filing the loss as data, information to be used, not a wound to nurse. She acknowledged the pain of the moment without letting it become the whole story. That distinction matters enormously in professional sport, where the difference between good players and great ones often comes down to exactly this: how quickly you turn heartbreak into fuel. She herself pointed to the fine margins involved, noting that in tight matches, everything can come down to just 1 or 2 points. A remarkably clear-eyed diagnosis for someone barely 21 years old, sitting in the wreckage of her biggest loss of her career. It wasn't self-pity, it was a scouting report on herself. That kind of self-awareness, paired with the hunger she'd already shown after beating Swiatek, is exactly why this loss doesn't read like an ending. It reads like a rough draft of something much bigger still coming. So here's the question everyone in women's tennis should be asking right now. If this is what Eala looks like after a loss, what happens when she finally puts it all together for 7 straight matches? Let's step back from the emotion for a moment and look at the numbers, because numbers don't lie, and the numbers tell a story that should genuinely unsettle the rest of the WTA Tour. Across this grass season alone, Eala compiled a 12-4 record, won a WTA 125 title in Birmingham, and reached the semifinals in Berlin, all before Wimbledon even began. Then, at the tournament itself, she didn't just beat lower-ranked players to pad her record. She defeated a former Wimbledon champion, a top 8 ranked player, and a defending Wimbledon champion, pushing her career record against top 10 opponents to 7 wins and 4 losses. Think about that ratio for a second. A win rate above 60% against the best players in the world is not the profile of a lucky underdog riding a hot week. That's the profile of a player who has quietly, methodically closed the gap between herself and the sport's elite, and is now starting to win those matches more often than she loses them. Her 4th-round finish lifted her to a projected career-high world ranking of number 28, a number that will only continue climbing as she banks ranking points from a tournament run that, 12 months earlier, would have seemed almost fantastical. And unlike players who peak once and disappear, Eala's trajectory across the entire season has been one of steady, compounding improvement, win over win, level over level. But maybe the most telling piece of evidence isn't in the results at all, it's in how she talks about herself. Most players, after the best result of their career, retreat into comfortable, safe language, gratitude, relief, a sense of arrival. Eala's language has consistently pointed forward instead. The insistence that emotion doesn't equal satisfaction, the willingness to publicly diagnose her own weaknesses rather than hide them, the refusal to treat a career-best Grand Slam run as a finish line rather than a checkpoint. This is exactly the mindset that separates players who have one great fortnight from players who build entire careers on top of one. History is full of both types, the one-fortnight wonders who peak, get remembered fondly, and never quite recapture that magic, and the ones who use that fortnight as proof of concept, evidence that the ceiling is much higher than anyone assumed, and then spend the following months and years methodically proving it. Everything about how Eala has spoken since Wimbledon suggests she sees herself firmly in that second category. She's not treating her Swiatek win as a career highlight to be framed and admired. She's treating it as confirmation that the work is paying off, and that there's considerably more work left to do. And that should be exactly what worries her rivals. Because a player who's happy with where she is can be caught, planned for, solved. A player who genuinely believes she's still hungry, still improving, still chasing something bigger, that's the player who keeps finding new levels precisely when you think you've figured her out. The hard court season is coming next. New surfaces, new opponents, new opportunities to prove that Wimbledon wasn't a one-off. If the numbers and the mindset she's shown so far are any indication, the rest of the tour should not be breathing easy just because she lost in the 4th round. If anything, they should be more nervous than ever. Every legendary career has a moment historians point back to and say, that's where it really began. Is this that moment for Eala? Let's talk about what comes next. Eala's Wimbledon run gave us history, heartbreak, and a genuine glimpse into the mindset of a future WTA contender. Whether this becomes the defining chapter of her career or simply the opening one is a story still being written, and we'll be here to cover every step of it. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter of Eala's rise. Drop a comment below telling us, do you think this was the beginning of something historic? We read every single one.